George Patton bet Bernard Montgomery £5 he'd have American troops in Brest within 5 days. The 6th Armored Division made it in 5. 200 miles of occupied Brittany, blown through in under a week. Patton won his bet. What came next cost nearly 10,000 American lives. The port they were racing toward was already becoming irrelevant. Cobra had ripped the Western Front wide open. Third Army's other 3 corps were tearing east toward Paris and the German border. The entire war had lurched forward faster than any pre-war plan had imagined. The Overlord logistics blueprint said, "Take the Brittany ports," so the blueprint stayed in force, even as the reason behind it evaporated. 3 infantry divisions, 2 ranger battalions, and British flamethrower tanks would spend 6 weeks grinding into a fortress defended by 40,000 Germans under a paratrooper general who'd been ordered to hold until his last round was spent. He'd demolish the harbor before surrendering. And when Brest finally fell on September 18, 1944, the Allied front line sat 500 miles to the east. Market Garden was dropping paratroopers over Holland. The port of Brest never received a single Allied supply ship. Not 1 ton, not 1 crate. If you find stories like this worth your time, take a moment to subscribe and hit the bell. We have much more coming for you. Your support is what keeps us moving forward. The plan to seize Brittany's ports wasn't some afterthought scribbled on a napkin. It was baked into Overlord from the very beginning. Allied planners had done the math. 37 divisions on the continent by September 1944 would need 26,000 tons of supplies every single day. The Normandy beaches and their temporary mulberry harbors couldn't handle that volume forever, and the Great Storm of June 19th had already wrecked 1 mulberry and damaged the other. Cherbourg, captured at the end of June, was being rebuilt, but the Germans had demolished it so thoroughly that full capacity was months away. The logisticians needed deep-water ports, and the biggest one on France's Atlantic coast was Brest. It had been the main port of entry for American troops in the First World War. Planners even envisioned supply convoys sailing directly from the United States to Brest, bypassing England entirely. On paper, Brittany wasn't optional. It was the spine of the entire supply architecture, and then Cobra blew the map apart. On July 25th, the American First Army punched through the German line west of St. Lo. What had been a grinding hedgerow-by-hedgerow crawl through Normandy turned overnight into a rout. German units disintegrated. Avalanches fell on July 30th. The Pont-au-Beau Bridge, the single bottleneck funneling traffic into Brittany, was seized intact on the 31st. And on August 1st, Patton's Third Army officially came to life. Now, here's where the gears jammed. The original Overlord blueprint called for Third Army to drive west into Brittany, secure the ports, and only then wheel east to join the advance toward the Seine. The breakout had made that sequence absurd. The German front wasn't bending, it had snapped. Patton's instinct, and Bradley's too, was to pour everything east, get behind the collapsing German line, and end the war in France before winter. Brittany could wait. It couldn't wait entirely. Eisenhower and Schaeff still wanted those ports. Bradley compromised. Patton would send 1 corps west into Brittany, while his other 3 corps turned east. The 1 corps heading the wrong direction was Troy Middleton's 8th Corps. Middleton was a careful, methodical infantryman. He'd commanded a division in Sicily and was respected for his steadiness. Patton respected him too, but Patton had no patience for steady. And now Middleton found himself caught between 2 chains of command that couldn't agree on what "take Brittany" actually meant. Bradley wanted an orderly advance, secure St. Malo on the north coast first, then push west to Brest. Middleton agreed. Patton wanted to skip St. Malo entirely, bypass everything, and send armor straight for Brest at maximum speed. And Patton, being Patton, didn't wait for the chain of command to sort itself out. He drove to the 6th Armored Division's camp, found Major General Robert Grow, and told him face to face, "Get to Brest." 5 days. He'd bet Montgomery £5 on it. Grow didn't need convincing. He was an armor man trained to exploit, and Patton's kind of officer. On August 1st, his division launched west in 2 parallel columns. Combat Command A pushed south to entrain. Combat Commands B and R seized the bridge at Pontorson, officially crossing into Brittany. Near Brie, 2 miles east of Pontorson, the advance guard drove straight into a German ambush. 88s, mortars, bazookas, small arms hit them from prepared positions along the road. 3 self-propelled guns from the 231st Field Artillery were knocked out in the opening minutes. The column fought through, pushed another 28 miles that day, and kept rolling. So Grow had his orders from Patton. The problem was, Middleton had different ones. On August 3rd, Middleton, unaware of how far west Grow had already pushed, ordered the 6th Armored to halt. He wanted the division available to help reduce Saint-Malo and Dinard on the north coast. Since Patton had given the dash order directly to Grow, Middleton knew nothing of it. The next day, Patton showed up at Grow's position again and overrode the halt personally. Middleton, discovering the division was already well past Saint-Malo, adjusted his own orders. The contradiction resolved itself through geography and Patton's force of personality, not through any clean decision from above. And if you think the command confusion stopped there, it didn't. 40 miles south, John Wood's 4th Armored Division was dealing with the same whiplash. Wood had taken Rennes by August 4th and pushed his lead elements 40 miles beyond the city to Ban-de-Bretagne and Derval. His orders said continue southwest to Quiberon Bay and Lorient. Wood wanted to turn east. He could see the opportunity. The German line was gone, the road to the Loire and beyond was wide open, and here he was driving deeper into a peninsula full of ports nobody was going to need. Wood wasn't wrong. His division would eventually be pulled east, and it would become one of the finest armored formations in the European theater, tearing through Lorraine and smashing German panzers at Ericourt. In early August, Brittany was consuming it for nothing. Grow, meanwhile, reached the outskirts of Brest on the evening of August 6th. 200 miles in 5 days through occupied territory, fighting through ambushes and bypassing pockets of resistance. At Huelgoat, 30 miles east of the port, a full German paratrooper force hit the division head-on. Grow's lead elements were struck hard enough that he sent a flash message to Middleton. Under attack, codes in danger, may destroy. The scale of the threat became clear within hours. This wasn't a defensive line, it was a stranded unit caught moving. The 6th Armored wheeled around and counterattacked. The Germans, caught in their marching column, were shattered. 1,000 prisoners taken in a single afternoon. By the evening of August 7th, Grow's tanks sat on the ridgelines east of Brest, looking down at the city, and there they stopped. What Grow found wasn't a port waiting to be liberated. It was Festung Brest, Fortress Brest. The Germans had turned the city into a layered defensive position with exterior and interior rings of fortification, concrete bunkers, pillboxes, and trench networks arranged for mutual support. Artillery covered every approach. The garrison numbered roughly 40,000 men under General der Fallschirmtruppe Hermann-Bernhard Ramcke, a paratrooper commander and Africa Corps veteran whom the historian Derek Mallet would later describe as fanatical without qualification. Ramcke had received direct orders to hold until the last bullet. He had already expelled the civilian population from the city. Every mouth that didn't carry a rifle was a drain on rations he'd need for a long siege. Only about 2,000 civilians refused to leave. Ramcke had enough concrete, enough artillery, and enough fanaticism to make the Americans pay for every yard. A single armored division couldn't crack this. Grow knew it within hours. He set up a cordon outside the range of most German artillery and requested infantry, heavy artillery, and sustained air support. None of it was coming quickly. Everything was flowing east. Here's the thing about plans built into the architecture of a massive coalition war. They acquire a momentum of their own. Canceling Brittany would have meant someone at SHAEF standing up and saying the entire logistical framework behind Overlord was wrong, that the ports the whole invasion had been structured around weren't needed anymore. Nobody wanted to be that person. Eisenhower still believed Brest could serve as a direct pipeline from the United States. Bradley didn't want 40,000 armed Germans sitting in Patton's rear area. The reasons were real enough. Whether they were worth what came next is a different question entirely. The men who would answer that question with their bodies were already on their way to Brittany. So Middleton was ordered to take Brest. And Middleton, who didn't have the troops, the ammunition, or the air cover to do it quickly, settled in for a siege. Bradley sent Middleton 3 infantry divisions, the 2nd Division under Major General Walter Robertson, the 8th Division under Brigadier General Donald Stroh, and the 29th Division under Major General Charles Gerhardt, the same 29th that had waded onto Omaha Beach on June 6th and fought its way through the hedgerows to St. Lo. These weren't green units. The 2nd and 29th had been pinched out of the line as the Falaise pocket shrank, experienced formations that had been through some of the worst fighting in Normandy. Now they were being shipped west, away from the collapsing German front, to attack a fortress that was growing less strategically relevant with every passing day. The full assault began on August 25th. Picture the timing. On that same day, French and American troops were marching into Paris. The liberation of the French capital was playing out on radios and newsreels around the world. And 500 miles to the west, 3 American divisions were throwing themselves at a ring of concrete fortifications in a port city most people back home had never heard of. Middleton had arranged his divisions in a crescent around the eastern and southern approaches to Brest. The 2nd Division held the left in the east. The 8th Division took the center. The 29th Division was on the right in the west. Rangers from the 2nd and 5th Battalions were attached for close assault work. The plan called for a coordinated infantry assault supported by artillery, tactical air, and even naval gunfire from a British battleship offshore. The plan also called for ammunition. Middleton had requested 20,000 tons for the first 3 days of the attack. Third Army allocated 5,000. On August 23rd, Bradley and Patton visited Middleton's headquarters in person and agreed to increase the allocation to 8,000 tons. Even that didn't fully arrive before the assault kicked off. And here was the first taste of the bitter irony that would define the entire siege. The ammunition Middleton needed to crack open the port was being rationed because the Allies didn't have enough port capacity to supply their armies. The very shortage that justified taking Brest was starving the attack on Brest. The assault opened with everything Middleton could scrape together. Artillery hammered the outer fortifications. Tactical aircraft dropped high explosives and napalm on bunker positions. The infantry went forward and ran straight into the reality of Festung Brest. Ramcke had designed his defense in depth. The outer ring was a network of mutually supporting bunkers, pillboxes, and trench systems built into the rocky Breton terrain. Fields of fire interlocked. Minefields covered the approaches. Anti-tank guns were sighted to sweep every road and avenue of advance. The inner ring anchored on the old French forts, Fort Montbarry, Fort Carenru, and the fortified high ground the Americans would call Sugarloaf Hill was even worse. These weren't field fortifications. They were stone and concrete strongpoints that had been built to resist naval bombardment, repurposed by the Germans with modern weapons and reinforced with fresh concrete. The fighting that developed wasn't anything like the mobile war raging across eastern France. It was closer to the Pacific, closer to Iwo Jima than to the breakout from Normandy. American infantrymen found they couldn't move in the open. German machine guns and anti-tank guns were sighted to sweep the approaches, and Ramcke's paratroopers were disciplined enough to hold their fire until the Americans were fully exposed. Advancing across open ground was a way to get your company wiped out. So the infantry adapted satchel charges, Bangalore torpedoes, concentrated small arms fire to suppress a bunker while a team worked around the flank. Engineers crawled forward with demolition charges, blew holes in walls, and the rifle squads moved through the gaps, house to house, bunker to bunker. And when they'd taken a position, they dug in and held it against the counterattacks Ramcke's men launched every time they lost ground. Bite and hold, one strong point at a time. The 29th Division, attacking on the western flank, was taking casualties at a rate its officers recognized from Omaha Beach. By September 1st, 1 week into the full assault, the division had suffered 1,200 casualties. The 115th Regiment was fighting for the high ground west of the city, while the 175th Regiment ground forward against Fort Carenroe and Sugarloaf Hill. Every 100 yards cost men. And the men knew, the way frontline troops always know, that the war had moved on without them. The trucks rolling past them on the Brittany roads were heading east, carrying fuel and shells to the armies chasing the Germans toward the Rhine. The men dying in front of Fort Montbarret were fighting for a port their own supply chain had already written off. Now, there's a question that gets asked about wars like this, usually by people who weren't in them. Why didn't the men on the ground just refuse? If the objective was pointless, why keep attacking? The answer is simpler than the question deserves. A rifleman in the 29th Division didn't have a map of the entire Allied front. He had the bunker in front of him, the men next to him, and an order to take the next ridgeline. The strategic absurdity of Brest existed at a level of command he'd never see. Down in the rubble, there was only the fight. Middleton, who could see the strategic picture, pushed for more resources. He needed artillery ammunition above all. The guns were chewing through shells faster than the supply chain could deliver them, and every lull in the barrage gave Ramcke's engineers time to repair damage and relay mines. Rain and fog rolled in off the Atlantic, grounding tactical aircraft for days at a stretch. Without air support and without sustained artillery, Middleton had to suspend offensive operations entirely and go back to the slow, grinding, bite-and-hold approach. And while Middleton's men were digging their way through concrete one bunker at a time, the strategic ground beneath the entire operation was collapsing. On September 4th, British troops rolled into Antwerp. They took the city and its massive deep-water port essentially intact, the docks, the cranes, the warehouses, all of it standing and functional. Antwerp was the largest port in Europe. If the Allies could get it running, the supply crisis that had justified the entire Brittany campaign would evaporate overnight. There was a catch. German forces still held the Scheldt estuary, the 60-mile waterway connecting Antwerp to the open sea, and clearing them would take months. The port was intact on paper. It wouldn't receive its first cargo ship until late November, and yet the capture of Antwerp changed the equation entirely. Brest, even if taken intact, was now 500 miles behind the front. Trucking supplies from Brest to the armies in eastern France would consume nearly as much fuel as the supplies themselves were worth. The logistics math that had made Brittany essential in May made it absurd in September. 3 days later, on September 7th, Schief formally canceled Operation Chastity, the plan to build a major artificial harbor at Quiberon Bay on Brittany's south coast. The cancellation was quiet. No announcement, no press conference. The plan simply ceased to exist. One of the two pillars that had justified the entire Brittany campaign had been pulled out. The other pillar, Brest itself, was still standing, technically. Nobody pulled that one. The irony cuts deeper when you look at what the siege was consuming. Every ton of artillery ammunition fired into the bunkers around Brest was a ton that wasn't reaching Patton's Third Army in Lorraine, where the advance had ground to a halt for lack of fuel and shells. Every aircraft diverted to bomb Ramcke's fortifications was an aircraft not supporting the push toward the Siegfried Line. The Siege of Brest wasn't just failing to solve the supply crisis, it was actively making it worse. The port was eating the resources it was supposed to generate. Eisenhower knew all of this. Bradley knew it. Patton, whose attention was now entirely focused on his drive across eastern France, certainly knew it. And yet, in early September, Eisenhower authorized maximum air support for the final assault on Brest. His reasoning, as far as the record shows, was twofold. The 40,000 Germans inside Brest represented a standing threat to the Allied rear if left undealt with, and pulling Middleton's divisions out now would mean the casualties already taken had been for nothing. It was the logic of escalation. The investment of lives already made became the justification for investing more. Here's a truth about war that the classroom version tends to skip. The most dangerous word in a general's vocabulary isn't retreat, it's continue. Retreating is visible, immediate, and politically damaging. Someone has to stand up and own it. Continuing costs lives, but it costs them gradually in numbers that don't make headlines until the battle's over. At Brest, nobody wanted to be the man who said stop. Eisenhower had bigger problems. Bradley had bigger problems. Patton was in Lorraine. Middleton was the only one who had to sit in Brittany and watch the casualty reports come in, and Middleton didn't have the authority to cancel his own mission. So the siege continued. Back on the ground, the arrival of reinforcements and a buildup of ammunition through early September gave Middleton what he needed for a coordinated push. 9th Army under Major General William Simpson briefly took administrative responsibility for forces in Brittany, helping to straighten out the supply pipeline. Simpson arranged for ammunition ships to dock at smaller ports and beaches near Brest, bypassing the overstretched main supply lines. It was a creative fix. It was also another reminder that the entire purpose of taking Brest, securing a major port, had devolved into using tiny ports to supply the attack on the big one. The critical obstacle on the western approach was Fort Montbarry. The old French fort had been reinforced by the Germans with additional concrete, and its position commanded the ground the 29th Division needed to break into the city from the west. Middleton called in a special weapon, Crocodile flame-throwing tanks from the 141st Regiment, Royal Armored Corps. These were Churchill tanks fitted with trailer-mounted fuel tanks and a hull-mounted flamethrower capable of projecting burning liquid at ranges up to 80 yards. On September 14th, 4 Crocodiles led the assault on Fort Montbarry. The attack went wrong almost immediately. The terrain channeled the tanks into predictable approaches, and German anti-tank fire found them. 3 of the 4 Crocodiles were knocked out. The assault was called off. 2 days of careful preparation followed. Engineers cleared routes, infantry suppressed anti-tank positions, and the plan was rebuilt from scratch. On September 16th, 6 Crocodiles went in again. This time, the approach worked. The flamethrowers poured burning fuel into the fort's embrasures and ventilation shafts. The defenders who survived surrendered. 80 men came out of Fort Montbarry, 80 out of a garrison that had held up an entire division for days. Fort Carenru, assaulted by the 175th Regiment on the same day, yielded 100 prisoners. These numbers tell you everything about the kind of fight this was. The Germans weren't surrendering in company strength. They were holding until the position was physically untenable and then giving up in handfuls. The fall of Fort Montbarry cracked open the western approach to the city. The 29th Division pushed into the outskirts of Brest from the west, while the 2nd Division pressed in from the east. The 8th Division drove down the center, and now the fighting moved into the streets. Urban combat in Brest was a house-clearing operation against defenders who'd had weeks to prepare. Ramcke's men had mined intersections, booby-trapped doorways, and set up interlocking fields of fire down the main streets. The Americans couldn't use armor effectively in the narrow lanes. Tanks were channeled into fire traps, and the rubble from artillery and airstrikes blocked the roads. Infantry squads blew holes in the walls of buildings and moved laterally through them, room by room, avoiding the streets entirely. Engineers followed with satchel charges to collapse structures behind the advance, denying the Germans any chance to re-infiltrate. The 2nd Ranger Battalion, attached to the 29th Division, was used for some of the most dangerous close-quarters work. Rangers specialized in assaulting fortified positions, and at Brest, they earned that reputation one concrete bunker at a time. The 5th Rangers operated along the Brittany coast, reducing smaller strongpoints and clearing German holdouts that might threaten the rear of the main assault. And through all of this, Ramcke held. He shuffled his paratroopers to plug gaps, reinforced threatened sectors with whatever men he could pull from quieter parts of the perimeter, and kept his artillery firing. The paratrooper general rejected Middleton's surrender demands with contempt. His justification, as far as the record preserves it, was that every day Brest held out was a day the Americans couldn't use those divisions elsewhere. In this, at least, Ramcke was right. The Siege of Brest was accomplishing exactly what the German dictator's fortress strategy was designed to do: pin down superior Allied forces on a secondary objective while the main front reorganized. The cost kept climbing. By the 2nd week of September, total American casualties in the Brittany campaign had crossed 8,000, with the bulk concentrated at Brest. The 29th Division alone had lost well over 2,000 men since arriving in Brittany. Replacements filtered in, but not fast enough, and the replacements arriving were increasingly raw. Men pulled from rear area assignments and service units, given a rifle, and pointed at the line. The experienced NCOs and junior officers who'd survived Omaha Beach and the Bocage were being ground away in a siege that their own high command had largely stopped talking about. What made Brest particularly grinding was the way the terrain worked against the attackers at every scale. At the macro level, the city sat on a peninsula jutting into the Atlantic with water on 3 sides. The only approaches were from the east and southeast, through ground the Germans had spent weeks fortifying. At the micro level, every ridge line, every stone farmhouse, every sunken road on the outskirts had been turned into a firing position. The bocage country the Americans thought they'd left behind in Normandy had a cousin here in Brittany: dense hedgerows, narrow lanes, restricted fields of vision. Tanks couldn't range freely. Artillery observers couldn't see what they were shooting at half the time. The infantry had to do the seeing for them, and seeing at Brest meant getting close enough to take fire. Middleton rotated battalions through the line to keep exhaustion from cracking his divisions. A battalion would spend 2 or 3 days on the assault, grinding forward a few hundred yards, and then pull back into reserve while another unit took over. The Germans had no such luxury. Ramcke's garrison couldn't rotate, couldn't reinforce from outside, couldn't replace its casualties. The clock was working against the defenders. The problem was that the clock was also working against the strategic justification for the whole operation. September 8th was the turning point on the ground, if not in the war. Middleton had finally marshaled enough ammunition and air support for a coordinated corps-level assault. Eisenhower had authorized the maximum number of available aircraft. Heavy bombers from bases in England hit the fortifications in waves. Middleton's artillery, now adequately supplied after Simpson's logistical workaround, laid down a sustained barrage that lasted hours. When the infantry went forward, they had the firepower behind them that should have been there from the beginning. The outer defensive ring, which had held for 2 weeks, began to crack. German positions that had been impervious to the earlier piecemeal attacks couldn't withstand the concentrated bombardment. The 2nd Division broke through on the eastern approach, overrunning a string of bunkers and capturing several hundred prisoners in a single push. The 8th Division cracked the center, and the 29th, on the western flank, began the approach to the inner defense line and the forts that guarded the city itself. From September 8th onward, the siege became a compression. The German perimeter shrank daily. Ramcke pulled his surviving units back toward the inner ring, the old French forts, the submarine pens built with meters-thick reinforced concrete, and the walled core of the city. The paratroopers fought for every position, counterattacking each time the Americans seized a strong point, but the math had turned irrevocably. Ramcke was running out of room, out of men, and out of ammunition. What he wasn't running out of was willingness to keep going. On September 12th, Middleton sent a formal surrender demand. Ramcke refused. The fighting resumed within hours. What followed was some of the most intense close-quarters fighting American troops experienced in the European theater. The inner forts were medieval stone structures that the Germans had modernized with steel-reinforced concrete, communications trenches, and interlocking fields of fire. Each fort was essentially a self-contained garrison. Taking one didn't automatically open the way to the next. The Americans had to clear the ground between them under fire from positions they hadn't reached yet. The 115th Regiment of the 29th Division spent 3 days fighting for the high ground west of Fort Montgomery before the Crocodiles could even be brought up. Every approach was mined. German observers on the fort's ramparts could call down mortar fire on any movement in the surrounding fields. The regiment's rifle companies were rotating men through the assault at a pace that chewed through platoon leaders in days. When a lieutenant went down, a sergeant took over. When the sergeant went down, a corporal led. Brest was consuming small unit leadership the way a furnace consumes fuel. And for what? The men on the line couldn't answer that question. The men at Corps headquarters couldn't answer it either, not honestly. Even Middleton, the steadiest hand in the operation, had privately begun to regard the siege as a commitment that had outlived its purpose. The war was 500 miles away now. Patton's Third Army had crossed the Moselle. The British were in Belgium. Market Garden was being planned. And here in Brittany, 3 American divisions and their supporting elements were smashing themselves against stone walls, defended by a paratrooper general who'd rather demolish the port than hand it over. Ramcke had made his intentions clear from the beginning. He'd ordered the systematic destruction of every facility in Brest that could serve the Allies: cranes, docks, warehouses, rail connections. His engineers were sinking ships in the harbor channel and demolishing the quays, even as the fighting raged. By the time the inner forts began to fall, the port of Brest was already dead. The prize Middleton's men were paying for in casualties had been destroyed before they could take it. Patton won his 5 pounds. Grove's 6th Armored Division reached the outskirts of Brest in 5 days, just as Patton had promised Montgomery. 200 miles through occupied France, ambushes at Brie and Hulgoat, 1,000 German prisoners taken along the way. The bet was won on August 7, 1944. 43 days later, the city fell. 3 infantry divisions, 2 ranger battalions, a regiment of British flamethrower tanks, and every aircraft Eisenhower could spare had spent 6 weeks grinding through a fortress that its own defenders were dismantling from the inside. 9,831 American casualties, 37,000 German prisoners, and at the center of it all, a harbor choked with sunken ships, smashed cranes, and demolished quays. The 5-pound bet was about speed. What followed was about something else entirely, the weight of a plan that nobody could stop. Overlord had said Brittany, Schaeff had said Brest. And once those words were in the machinery kept running, feeding divisions and ammunition and air sorties into a port that was already being destroyed by the men defending it. Patton knew it was pointless. Bradley suspected it. Eisenhower had his reasons, and they weren't irrational. 40,000 armed Germans in your rear area are a legitimate concern. The trouble is that legitimate concerns stacked on top of sunk costs, stacked on top of institutional inertia, produce outcomes that no single person chose and nobody can defend after the fact. There's something in the way large organizations fight wars, and it isn't limited to wars, that makes stopping harder than starting. Canceling an operation means admitting the casualties already taken were for nothing. Continuing means the casualties still to come might somehow retroactively justify the ones already spent. It's a logic that makes sense in the moment and collapses the instant you step outside it. At Brest, nobody stepped outside it until the last German came out of the last bunker with his hands up. The port never opened. Not a single Allied supply ship entered the harbor of Brest after its capture. The cranes stayed in the water. The channel stayed blocked. The logistics planners crossed Brest off their maps and moved on to Antwerp, which wouldn't fully open until late November after a brutal campaign to clear the Scheldt estuary, a campaign that was delayed in part because Montgomery chose Market Garden over the Scheldt, repeating at a larger scale the same mistake of chasing a dramatic objective while the boring, essential one waited. Lorient held out until May 10, 1945. Saint-Nazaire surrendered the next day. Neither port was ever assaulted. Neither port was ever used. The German garrisons sat behind American lines for 9 months, contained by a fraction of the force that had been thrown at Brest, and surrendered when the war ended. The result was the same. The cost was not. 9,831 American casualties bought a port that never loaded a single crate. 200 miles down the coast, patience and a thin cordon bought the same outcome for almost nothing. The lesson was there for anyone willing to read it. The men buried at the Brittany American Cemetery at St. James had already paid for it.